Hello there. I'd like to give a brief overview here of a game called The China Incident. It's from the Wargamer magazine in 1984, and it's why am I showing it? Well, because I find it an interesting game, although it's a sort of a rather obscure ancient magazine game. It has enough differences in it to make it an interesting, at least a solitaire exercise to investigate. So what I'm going to do in the video is give you a brief look at the components, explain roughly how the game plays, and then list the 5 points that make this an interesting situation and a game design for me. So it has 8 pages of rules. It needs some errata. They're easily findable on the internet. And the rules are the errata are essentially additions. There's not clarifications, I believe. But points that were missed out. Yes, there's some clarifications like in the wording of terrain, but generally the rules as given they explain the game well, and considering you've got some sort of different ideas, it's fairly simple to get a grasp of what's going on. I did have to highlight a lot of them because there's quite a few different things in this game. For example, you've got different modes affecting zones of control. Every time a unit loses a strength point, it loses a point of movement, which isn't something you normally get. In standard war games, you've got supply rules, and there's important points like supply, how it can be traced. Another thing that is unusual is that units stacked together may be attacked separately unless they occupy a city hex. So if you're facing a stack of 3 units, which is the most in this game, you can choose one. You don't have to attack them all. So some quite different ideas already there in that movement is reduced by step losses or strength point losses, and you can select your attacks. So that's the rules. I was just sort of flicking through for you, just 8 pages of rules. You get some inserts which you need to photocopy because they're embedded in the rules. You have to bring them out, and they are used to, initially you can place all your units on. The Japanese will have the turns, so the Japanese have all of these and some here. That will indicate the turns they come on. So these are actually at start units. These come on turn 1 and so forth. The game lasts for 27 turns. You can have Japanese still arriving on the 23rd turn. Then the nationalist Chinese, you have some that start set up in specific hexes, and then the rest you set up as you wish, with a few guidelines. And then finally there's 4 communist Chinese units which set up in the mountainous areas around here. So these list the strengths of the units. So this unit has a maximum strength of 7, and if it loses a strength point, what you can do is then place, oh sorry, that's a Japanese unit, so you would place a yellow one, and you would place this, which indicates it's in normal mode, and it's now at 6 strength, goes down to 5 strength like that. So, and there's a bit of record keeping like that. These markers also serve to indicate mode change. So this is concentrated mode, which gives you increased movement, but it's not as effective in attack. And the counters themselves, standard counters for this era, they include a normal mode, and then The Japanese can go into B, Banzai mode, which is concentrated, and it gives them a bonus on attack, but no movement ability. And the nationalist Chinese have an E entrenched mode, which is a similar thing. That affects zones of control as well. The communist Chinese are just, they're kind of like hordes. They don't have any subtlety in mode changing. So you need these tracks for strengths, and they recommend it also for tracking modes. Now that's partly important because you have a limited number of mode markers, so not all of your army can be in concentrated mode at any one time. But I actually opted to indicate concentrated mode just by turning the counters upside down, because then it's immediately visible on the board and you don't keep having to glance here for every counter. Another thing I did was that whenever a unit lost some strengths, I would just mark it with something else to show that that unit has lost a strength. Most units will not lose strength, and when they do lose strength, most units tend to disappear very quickly. Some will linger on, and they can gain replacements at the rate of 1 per turn, so they can sort of be brought back up. But as I said earlier, they will not have they will have a reduced movement capacity, so they are sitting ducks. So units don't tend to sit, sort of lose strength and move around much, unless you're the nationalist Chinese, the Japanese, who are moving forward. The nationalist Chinese are trying to retreat, so units left behind tend to get gobbled up quite quickly. So the map's quite functional, created by a young Kevin Zucker. I've embellished it a bit to put these red bits just to highlight where the strongholds are, and to highlight more where these are ports. They're very important for supply, particularly for the Japanese player. Essentially what you have is, Manchukuo here, so that is in the Japanese control at the beginning of the game, and then you have China itself here moving further that way, which isn't included. You have Hong Kong and Macau here, they're neutral areas, so the nationalists can be supplied through there. Then you also have French Indochina, which is off limits until towards the end of the game, and another smaller province here, which similarly is off limits. And these both contain important coastal supply areas too. You get a number of charts and tables. I'll speak about those in a minute. In fact, yes, let me speak about them now. So these, all the ones here are listing weather effects. So there's a line down the middle of the board. You see this is the mountainous region up here, and this is loads of rivers. You have the Yangtze here, I think that's the Yellow River here, and the Pearl River here. I think that's the Red River. You have some river defence forces. The nationalists can move along the rivers. The Japanese themselves can move from supplied ports along rivers as well, and they're also able to invade from these arrowed hexes, apart from having their units come on through Manchukuo here. So we have swamp terrain around here which is impassable, but it's interesting to note that even in the swamp terrain there are cities, and that's going to become especially useful for the communist. I'll speak about that later too. You also have a Shantung province here which is neutral at the start of the game. If the Japanese enter it, then the nationalists can, but that creates an interesting decision for the Japanese, like they mainly starting here in Manchukuo, moving through here, but it's a mountainous region, can be difficult to get through. Do they open up this major route here through Shantung? Do the nationalists wait to sort of pounce on that? Then these are interesting. These are floodplains. So in certain weather conditions, those hexes will be flooded and impassable unless there's a road or rail connection through them. You also get that rivers are distinguished from floodable rivers, and then further on they are not floodable. So these the rivers near the mountains are generally not floodable, but coming towards the coast, so sort of all the rivers around here, again in certain weather conditions, they will be impassable except over the roads, rails. And then perhaps that's the last important point to mention about the map, is the roads and rails connections. So you have a bold line which is road and rail, and you have a not so bold line which is just a road route. Now in any adverse weather condition apart from clear, you cannot trace supply along a normal road when it passes through a mountainous region. What this essentially means is it really determines how the game's going to play out, because you have a road rail connection around here and going all the way down to here, so through to the coastal ports here and through to a coastal port here. Now there are road rail partial connections up to here, and then you just have road here. So what that means is that the Nationalist Army, they trace a supply off the edge, and in clear weather they can trace off here, here, and they can always trace to these neutral ports and these ones when they open up in the end game. But essentially, as soon as there's non-clear weather, there's no supply through there. So that means their main supply is through here and to the neutral ports here. So they have this line they have to protect for supply. And you can see this is very near the Japanese start. So the Japanese want to cut that, which will effectively mean that that is the only supply route. Then there's that main supply line. And this will determine what's going to go on. Now, this is the end of my game. I finished the game on turn 20 just because essentially the Nationalists had been pushed back this far, and there was a flood weather conditions, so the supply line here is knocked off, and the Japanese managed to capture the important supply. Newly opened up supply routes, and they captured that one or two turns earlier. So all these national forces are out of supply, and they are going to wither and die very quickly, leaving just some communist strongholds and a couple of communist actual units. Now these splurges here are stronghold markers, so the communist gets the nationalist, the Chinese player, I should say, he plays both communist and nationalist, and that's an interesting thing I'll get to in just a minute. But placed on the map is a stronghold, which is a mobile, but it has a gradually increasing, according to a spiral like this each turn. It adds a zone of operation, which is essentially a very sticky zone of control. It adds 3 movement points. Most units have 2 movement points, or 3, maybe 5 in concentrated mode. So it's very difficult to move through those, and you have to move to the centre to destroy one and remove it from the board. So weather effects are very important. Then you have terrain effects. The terrain's quite interesting, that you have terrain in the hex determines which units can be there. For example, armour can never be in a mountain hex. But then movement is actually determined by the hex side, the terrain of the hex side. So in this hex, an armour unit could move from the plain into there, but it couldn't move from there over into there, despite the fact that that's probably a mountain hex. And it's an artifact of the age, is that something that's a bit annoying with this game is that you have to determine, is that a mountain hex or a plain hex? You have to say which is the general terrain, which covers more than 50%. So apart from the hex sides, which is very clear, if there's any part of terrain on hex side, that will affect movement in it. You have to determine what the terrain is, so what's actually allowed in the hex. So you have all of that. Then you have combat modifiers. You have a very sort of brief and simple combat results table here. So it goes up to 4-1 odds, 5-1 is automatic, etc. And the only results are no effect or retreat. So either the defender retreats, the attacker retreats, or both of you retreat. When both of you retreat, effectively that means the defender retreats first and the attacker can retreat by advancing into the defender's hex. And again, that's another interesting factor in this game, is that there's no actual losses on the combat results table, but the losses are a factor of movement. So if you spend 1 movement point on roads and roads rails, and 2 on plains, 3 on mountains, and you can't go into swamps and floods, that's basically movement costs. So if you have to retreat in a plane, that costs 2 movement points, which is 2 hits, so you lose 2 strength points as well. Plus, if you end in your movement in a zone of control, enemy zone of control, they will inflict losses on you through that as well. So losses are a function of retreat movement. So you can opt to retreat further and take more losses, or you could just retreat 1 hex, take what you have to take. So then the last thing I'll mention about the map, the components, is this, which is another thing that's interesting. It's called the defensive strength modifier table, and essentially what you do is when you are attacking, the defenders say, and typically the nationalists have strength 4, 5 or 6, some of 1 or 2, but say he's got strength of 4, then you roll a d6, and on a 1 you subtract 5 from that. On a 6 it will be 0, on a 5 minus 1, like that. And that's the strength you subtract. If you get 0 or less, you don't even need to roll on the odds table. But if you're reduced, say, from 4 down to 2, then your odds are based on that, the modifier of your defensive strength. Now that roll is modified by comparing modes, well, by each side's mode, each side's terrain. So the attacker's terrain also has an effect, and also the number of attackers. So the number of hexes that are attacking are added. So if there's 1 hex attacking, you'll always add 1 to that roll. If there's 2 hexes are attacking, you will add 2. So the difficulty of coordinating attacks in this terrain and war. So again, that's a very interesting factor, and it makes for a different style of play, in which essentially weak units will often just crumble away straight away. You won't even get to the odds attack, and but occasionally you will get a lucky roll, and if your weak unit's in the mountains and they're in entrenched mode, which gives you +2 bonus on that die roll, they might get lucky and actually get a strength bonus. So it can make that combat quite unpredictable, and it's a nice factor, a nice feature of the game. So finally, you have also sort of special strategic movement possibilities. That's moving by there's some air movement for 1 unit. There's moving along the rivers and from coast to coast. That's about it. So that's a rough overview of how the game, what the game is about. I've made up some markers. You have clear weather, rainy, flood, snow or storm, and like I said, it could be one weather. Each turn is 2 months long, and you're playing the game from 1937 to 1941, 27 turns like I said, and you roll for the north and the south and mark what weather it is in each region, and that will affect which hexes are impassable. So finally I come to the 5 points which make this an interesting game to play. It's not a standout game because it is a little bit fiddly and it's a bit different. It's not a sort of panzer pusher where that you're having great sweeping blitzkriegs. The turns do go very fast because the procedures are very simple, and often the nationalist is just sort of retreating. The Japanese is bringing on a few reinforcements. You don't have tons of units moving because the Japanese, they have to keep rear area forces to guard against communist strongholds springing up. So the 5 points that I think make this game really interesting, first of all, is the fact that the Chinese player takes the communists and the nationalists, but they can attack each other. You know, the Chinese player won't move the communists to attack him, but what happens is every turn, like I said, the nationalist player chooses to place a stronghold. They have to be placed on a city hex, and it has to be a certain distance away from any other units, so that, you know, out of a zone of control and movement. So it gives time for this stronghold to build up. So that's like a strong. Here's a newly placed stronghold, and that one was placed the turn before, so it's already on its 2nd strength point. That one's on its 3rd, and this one's been growing quite a lot. That one's going to be growing huge. And essentially what happens is each stronghold can reach 24 strength points. Now the game is won by, the Japanese player wins by having 3 times strength points left on the board than the combined Chinese totals. The nationalist player wins by having 3 times, by the Japanese player not winning and having 3 times the strength of the communist forces. So what that basically means is the nationalist player, they have to place 1 marker a turn as long as there are still markers to place. And these will grow in strength up to 24 strength points each, so they will grow bigger and stronger. And so he might place one fairly near some of his troops so that he can then zip in and destroy it, nip it in the bud before it gets too strong, because he's kind of competing against them. But on the other hand, he wants the nationalist forces. They can operate, they can be placed behind the Japanese lines. They can be placed anywhere on the board as long as, you know, it's out of these zones of control and movement range of a regular unit. And they are handy because as they grow, they will obstruct movement and supply, and so they can disrupt the Japanese. Where you can see it's virtually impossible to move through here. There was, in the end, the Japanese left those alone and had to say, okay, they're going to grow up to full strength, but we'll be able to contain them and still win the war with them. And so they kept popping up around here, and the Japanese has to either keep all of these cities covered, or have kind of fire brigades running around and whack-a-moling these strongholds as they pop up. But gradually, as the Japanese was covering that, the strongholds started springing up closer and closer near the nationalist Chinese forces themselves. So it's an interesting thing. It's kind of like a 1 versus 1 game, but then within one side there's a sort of another sub 1 versus 1 game going on. So in a way, though it's a 2-player game, you've kind of got a 3-player game going on. The communists could actually win, and that would be through the efforts of both the opposing sides and to neither's real intention. So that's a very interesting situation. You don't normally have that sort of 3rd player NPC player who's fighting for one side but also fighting against them like that. Then the second thing which makes this really interesting is the terrain and the weather effects versus re-movement, but most importantly resupply. Now this makes that whole campaign really interesting. As I indicated, you have a main supply route here and then a main supply route here, so to supply there and to supply there, and also supply here, but that's going to be probably quite quickly captured by the Japanese. They can move on in force quite easily here. I mean, as the Japanese, you start here, you could bring on your second turn units here, but you know, they're obviously quite far apart. You might want to do that to pin down nationalists, but you know, you can hold units off as a threat to do that. So it tends to be, I think, that the Japanese will be moving up this way like that. So they're trying to cut that supply route, which then means the nationalists have to fall back on this supply line. And so then the Japanese will be opening up a second front here to cut that supply line. And then when they get both of those, as happened in this game, the nationalists are just holding out, which they managed to do, hoping that they don't get any rainy weather or storms or anything to cut their supply line there before these open up on the 20th turn. And that did happen, but the Japanese got in there, so there was some fighting around the supply there, and they didn't quite get that far. And the weather didn't hold out, bang, and so all those blue units will actually be removed, because when you are isolated, which is out of supply, you lose a number of strength points equal to the movement points that would take you to get in supply. These guys are miles away from any supply, so they're effectively completely gone. So that makes for a very interesting situation in how the campaign plays out, how to defend and how to attack along those main supply routes, going for the supply, cutting the supply centres, and then combine that with these Japanese communist strongholds popping up. so that nationalists can cut supply from himself, but then that would also deny road routes through mountains and so forth to the Japanese. Yes, so with that is the main interest of the game, combined with the communists. Then, at least what I said before, you have to have rear area troops because of the communists popping up, and the interesting part of the game in the nationalist player working quite deftly, choosing which cities to put a stronghold in. So tying up as many Japanese troops as possible, and hopefully growing some so as to deny areas to the Japanese as they advance. So all in all, that makes for a very interesting game. And finally, the last point of interest, it was designed by a woman, Laurel Cochran. An interesting thing is that the only other wargame I have designed by a woman is Killer Angels, which features in this issue. So they came out about the same time, and I've played them both, and they're both interesting that they take somewhat of a different take on war games. And although Killer Angels became a war game through development, it was essentially a PhD thesis, so it was kind of like a study of supply and command control in the American Civil War. It was the developers sort of turned it into a game, but I don't know if I'm just making this up myself, but I see some similarities in this, and I don't know if it's to do with the fact that they are both women who designed, but this sort of attention to detail and not being tied or sort of used to, I guess, the main wargaming tropes. So designing a game more from the ground up than many, especially these older war games, well, even the modern war games are inclined to do. So a different take and an interesting game to play. I would recommend it as a two-player game. It's going to take you a good day to play it. The only thing is that you have to come to some agreement on how to figure out the terrain. I think it's all right if you you can agree on, okay, that's a plain rather than a mountain hex, although that is a mountain hex side. It's generally easy to do, but it can be harder when you come to lakes. Like, which hex is there a lake hex, or is that only on the hex sides? But apart from that, yeah, I would recommend it as a two-player game, although it is, it's a slow and a bit fiddly in the stronghold markers and these bits, unless you to make some modifications. That wasn't a problem for me once I decided to turn units upside down and mark units that had strengths lost. And this is very helpful to keep track of player reinforcements and which units have been destroyed and so forth. So that's it for now. As a solitaire game, it's great because you can take it at your leisure, and I personally find it interesting to explore these systems that people develop, as well as the situations which they are trying to illustrate by their rules set and what they focus on. So the weather, the terrain, and the supply routes are what Laurel Cochran determined were the important factors in this game and in this war, and that makes for this an interesting and even exciting game. Okay, over and out.